I come from a family history of early life trauma and abuse. There's a lot of violence, addiction, suicide. When I was a young scientist, I was really passionate, curious to understand more about the impact of early life trauma, how that renders an individual more vulnerable to addiction or mental health challenges. I've been studying the impact of trauma on the brain for 20 years, and what I can tell you is that there is a safer way. And just like trauma can change the brain, so too can recovery.
All right, that was tonight's guest, Dr. Kim Hellemens. I'm Daniel Unmanageable, and this is Hard Knox Talks, coming at you from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Treaty Number 6 territory, and the traditional homeland of the Métis people. Let's bring in Kim. Kim, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm sorry, I forgot to play the intro for you before the show.
Perfectly fine. I was like, oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
Looks good.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Well.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Is there anything that you'd like to say before we get started tonight?
Just happy to be here. Grateful to be sharing this space with you, this not so safe space. Grateful to see all the people joining in, and curious to hear any questions or comments as we have our conversation today.
All right. Well, let's not waste any time.
I should say I'm joining from Ottawa, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people.
Wonderful.
So I'd like to acknowledge the land that I live on and play and work.
All right. Without further ado, let's go.
This is Hard Knox Talks.
Okay, before we dive in, I just want to let our viewers and listeners know that tonight's live production is sponsored in part by the Elizabeth Fry Society of Saskatchewan, helping women before, during, and after incarceration, and Prairie Harm Reduction, emphasizing local action with national impact. To learn more about all our sponsors, visit www.hardknoxtalks.com. So, Kim, we heard a little bit about your story in the intro. And while we want to paint a broad stroke, I am interested to know a little bit about your transition from that lifestyle into the lifestyle that you had now, or, the lifestyles that you were around. Was it an obvious decision for you to enter into the field that you did? Or how did that play out?
Yeah. So I was always interested in how some people developed differences in behavior and really psychiatric illness, mental health, why some people developed ill mental health whereas others didn't, what made some people more vulnerable, others more resilient. And as I spoke about very briefly in the intro that you played, I was aware as a child and more so as a young teenager and adult that my parents have some family history of just challenging times and stressors. And I won't go too much into it because it's not really my story to tell. But I was aware of that. And I was aware of a lot of family history with addiction and ill mental health in particular. And was always kind of curious to try to understand, what led to this place? How are these experiences? How did that change the brain? How did that change the mind? And ultimately render some of my family members quite vulnerable to substance use disorders or addictions. And so when I started my undergraduate degree in psychology back in the 90s at McGill University, I was initially drawn to the field of psychology to try to be in the help-seeking role. I was interested in becoming like a clinical psychologist or clinician, and very quickly realized that nobody really understood what caused ill mental health. So I decided I wanted to be the one working behind the scenes and try to do the science and try to understand that. And so as part of my academic journey, when I started my graduate training at Queen's University, I gravitated, I guess I didn't really understand too much at the time, but now I realize it was because I was sort of on a journey to try to understand what was happening in my own family. But I was gravitated to the field of vulnerability to addiction. And in particular, my PhD research project was all on looking at the biological models of addiction, and in particular, how early life trauma or stress would render the organism more susceptible to addiction.
Hmm. So we talk a little bit about epigenetics in, in the title, in things like that.
Mhm,
Before we
mhm,
get into the talk
mhm.
here, what is epigenetics?
Right. And there will be no exam. Nobody panic at the end of today's
I might issue one. I
talk,
might issue
lecture.
one.
Yeah. Oh, could this be on the wheel? Maybe we could,
Yeah. Yeah. You
see
better
if
throw
somebody
down them.
answers one of my questions
Y'all
correctly.
better throw down
There we
them
go.
stars or you're getting an
Yeah,
exam.
yeah. So,
And suddenly Donna's face doesn't
epigenetics.
matter that much.
Oh, suddenly, yeah, it's all about the A, right? The gold star.
Yeah.
So epigenetics is sort of a newer emerging field of research trying to understand basically what causes behavioral changes or what causes behavioral differences. Um, and so for a long time, the argument was sort of the nature nurture debate. Have you heard
Mm.
this? Is it,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, nature, like is it our genes that ultimately determine our behavior, or is it nurture? Is it the environment that shapes our genes or
Mm-hmm.
shapes us that ultimately determines our behavior? And now we know it's nature via nurture. So one way to look at it is that while genes load the gun, environment ultimately pulls the trigger. And all that
Hmm.
is to say is that we're born with our genes that we inherit from our parents, right? One copy from mom, one copy from dad. And what doesn't change throughout experience is whether or not you have certain genes, they're always there, but experience changes how much those genes are expressed. So let me give you a bit more of an example. So genes code for things called proteins. Proteins form the basics of our entire body, including our skin. Every cell is formed from proteins. And in the brain, the main signaling molecule that communicates between neurons, they're called neurotransmitters, and neurotransmitters are proteins. And what epigenetics can do is, by virtue of life experiences, so stress or trauma or drug use, what that experience does is it alters the way that genes are expressed. So, for example, certain neurotransmitters could be produced in greater quantities with the experience of epigenetics. Now, let me give you an example that's not drug related. Imagine that you are somebody that's born in a very hot climate and you move to somewhere like Canada, which has a cold climate. Your brain and your body have to learn to adapt to that new environment. So you'll start to upregulate the production of genes involved in thermoregulation.
Hmm.
So epigenetics, again, very briefly, it's how the environment shapes our genes. It doesn't change whether or not you have certain copies of genes. It just changes how much those genes are being expressed.
So
So that's
let's go.
epigenetics.
That's amazing. So let's go a
Mhm,
little bit deeper into how can early life trauma lead to a life of addiction?
mhm. So yes, this is the
I mean, we talk about
yeah.
people wanting to escape the trauma, escape the pain, things
Mhm.
like that. But like, I'm sure that you can dig deeper than that.
For sure. And now it's shocking, honestly, that we're 2023. And we know so much research about how early life trauma changes the brain and renders and can render an individual vulnerable to substance use disorders. And yet, we don't really ask this in doctors' offices, right? When we're patients, like general practitioners, we don't really look at some of these experiences of early life trauma because it is one of the best predictors of later life, not only mental health, but also physical health outcomes. But what we know, scientists know it does change the brain. We don't really know the how, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But ultimately, what science knows is that when you experience these highly traumatic events, and they can be acute, they can be like one-off experiences, so experience of extreme sexual abuse, for example, or they can be chronic, so experiences of neglect, poverty even is considered a chronic stressor. What science knows is that um, these highly stressful experiences do what they're meant to do, which is to activate the brain's stress centers, right? And the so called fight or flight responses. And so, what's happening is the brain is saying, recognizing that there is a threat, alerting all the neural resources to say, hey, there's a threat here, we need to cope with it, and ultimately initiating that fight or flight response, which leads to a cascade of hormones throughout the body as well as neurotransmitters in the brain to cope with that threat. With these experiences of early life trauma, they're so stressful, they're so the amplitude is so great that ultimately what it does is it kind of turns on key brain regions that are involved in consolidating memories related to fearful events, so that everything in the brain is really about avoiding that threat or that stressful circumstance in the future, learning to avoid any stimuli, things in the environment that are even associated with it. So the smell of somebody's aftershave, for example, with a sexual abuse, the sight of somewhere, a dark alley where you might have been attacked, and so on. And what that does is over time, you can imagine that the individual is always on high alert, right? You're hyper vigilant. You're kind of always like being watchful, mindful of when that threat could happen. And so scientists know that one of the things that one of the outcomes of early life trauma is it ramps up the activities of the brain involved in processing fear. And so we know that this leads to somebody constantly feeling unsafe. And the other thing that happens with early life trauma is it ramps down the activity of other parts of the brain that are involved in coding for reward or pleasurable events. Again, scientists don't really know the how, but we know that this is the outcome. So you've got this ramped up, feeling fearful all the time, dampened reward system. And we know what substances do is they go, whoop, oh, I feel safe now. I feel comfortable. I feel like I can make human connection, and okay, now I feel normal, right? So we have this sort of regulation of these systems in the brain that are otherwise too high or too low. And so that's why scientists believe that ultimately these early life traumatic experiences, they have such a powerful impact on key brain regions that are involved in fear, pleasure, metabolic, right? How you store energy. Happens to food when you eat it, because if you're constantly under threat and stress, the way that you store that food source changes entirely. So every single organ in the body is impacted by these chronic stressful circumstances or even acute stressful circumstances. And so there's a lot of work that says that a lot of substance use disorders can be explained by this, the individual learning, this is what's going to make me feel normal. This is what's going to make me feel better, right? And instead of recognizing a society, we go, instead of saying, hey, wow, how can we support you? Instead, we say, you're a criminal. We need to put you in jail. We need to ostracize you. We need to not provide you with the appropriate treatments because that you brought that on yourself, right?
Which further broadens the gap between the things you just spoke about, right? Wow.
For sure.
Yeah, that's definitely perpetuating the problem. We got some comments coming in here. Donna, you want to look at some comments?
For sure I do.
All right, let's go.
Now that I'm not looking at other comments, we'll look at these ones.
She's the comment specialist now.
So Solon Tacher said that makes a lot of sense. And I can't recall exactly in what regard that was, but I do.
Everything makes a lot of sense.
Everything makes sense.
Everything Kim says makes sense.
Yeah.
If you don't believe me, continue watching and then watch the episode when she was on previously.
Yeah.
And Rise North, thanks for the comment, says, our children in care have such high trauma. The first 2 years are most important. And like I remember reading that, with pregnancy, with the kids and stuff and trying to be a good mom or whatever, that the first 2 years are super integral. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that actually comes from a very real life experiment. And I say real life experiment because it was one that happened as a result of sort of socio-political forces in Ceausescu's regime in Romania in the 1980s. I'm not sure if you're familiar with what happened. Was Ceausescu was the ruler at the time, took away all money. He made, first of all, abortion illegal and took away all funding from social services. So what would happen then is we had a lot of babies that were being born and put into these extremely grim orphanages where they were literally metal cages, metal cribs. Babies were never picked up. They were never hugged. They were never played with. They were just given the bare minimum of food and water. And then these obviously these orphans then grew up, and scientists, this is what was a real world experiment, because otherwise we would never randomly assign a population of children into these kinds of horrific conditions. But scientists were then able to study these individuals when they became adults, and saw the huge impact of these neglectful, hugely traumatic experiences of these children on their day-to-day well-being. And this is where that data comes from, is that if the babies were adopted somewhere before the age of 2, there was a chance for that plasticity of the brain to compensate for these horrific, neglectful circumstances. After the age of 2, it was less probable to be able to recoup from, and this is like, again, very extreme adverse events for children, hugely neglectful. So yes, those first 2 years of life, lots of things happening neurodevelopmentally, particularly around learning attachment styles, which is really important.
So we've got another comment come in here that I want to touch on before we go into the next question that I have for you. Donna, if you would.
Susan Sims, and thank you for your comment and openness, Susan. She says, I never knew that my addiction could affect my granddaughter until I went to treatment and studied epigenetics. It scares me to know she had been predisposed. I pray she never knows the ugly reality of addiction.
So, and that leads really well into my,
one more quick one. Autumn MT, I just happened to catch it quickly here, but she wants to say that she loves how you're explaining epigenetics in such an accessible way, and that's why we love Kim, because she does. She's awesome at this. I first learned about it in university and always found it fascinating.
Sure is. And thank you, Autumn. Thank you, Suzanne, for those comments. And I appreciate that it is something that we're increasingly learning more about, is the concept of epigenetics. But we'll have some great, I'm sure, positive and optimistic comments towards the end of this episode.
So how does epigenetics play a role in the intergenerational transmission of addiction?
Right. So this is a lot of the epigenetics research, which really isn't in its infancy when we think about the span of science. Like, a lot of the epigenetics work came out of actually labs at McGill University in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s. So considering that, we've got 20 years, 30 years of research, and we're still sort of learning more. But what we do know is, so epigenetics is essentially, what happens is that your genes are kind of wrapped around this chromatin, it's called, structure in the cells, and it's kind of like, if you can imagine, like a thread in a spool, right? So it's kind of wrapped around the chromatin structure, and what happens is the environment can add on these sort of tags, these molecular tags to this chromatin structure, which either makes it very loose or tightens it up. And what happens when it loosens it, it means that the genes are more likely to be expressed. When it tightens it up, it means that the genes are going to be sort of close together. And so,
so hang on. What do you mean expressed? A gene is expressed.
Right. Gene is expressed. Okay, so we have all these sections of DNA, right, which contain hundreds of millions of amino acid base pairs that individually mean nothing, but the groupings of these amino acid base pairs are essentially what codes for a specific gene, which is essentially long strings of these amino acids. And when a gene is ready to be transcribed, which is how it gets turned into a protein, it needs to kind of, there have to be signals coming into the cell nucleus to tell it to unravel that section of DNA. And then it adds in these molecular signals to come in, and it basically snips it it doesn't snip it, but kind of does, but takes it and just brings in that, you remember basic biology, the strand of messenger RNA, which then copies the sections of the template of the DNA, and then that messenger RNA comes out of the nucleus, gets into what are called the ribosomes, which then transcribe it into the strings of amino acids, which are grouped together to form the gene. Okay, so that's what I mean by like it's all kind of tightened up in there, and these molecular signals come in and loosen it or tighten it. And that's ultimately the environment does that. It adds in these signals to loosen or tighten the genes to be able to be expressed. And by expressed, it's just you're making more of it. You're making more of that protein. So you're making more prefrontal cortical dopamine, for example, to allow you to pay attention in this podcast.
Okay, now say everything over. I wasn't listening. No.
No. So essentially, yeah, so that's how like the molecular signaling, like we've done this in, and there's beautiful animal models that have done that have demonstrated that if you give animals like injections of things like cocaine, you see this massive change in how certain genes all throughout the brain are differentially expressed. And then you can give the chronic doses of cocaine and you get more, either some genes are silenced or other genes are overexpressed. So they see this in animal models. And then what you can do is you can fake it. You can overexpress certain genes or silence certain genes, and the animal behaves as if it has a long history of cocaine use. So this is how scientists are able to really hone in and think this must be the mechanism by which the brain changes in response to substances. Because it's substance use is not, it's taking the brain beyond normal. Does that make sense? Like the brain is trying to maintain a constant homeostasis, which is another way of saying steady state. So it's trying to maintain constant water balance, temperature balance, sugar balance. It's also trying to maintain pleasure. So when you take substances, the brain is suddenly going, whoa, this is too much. I need to initiate physiological processes to bring it back down to baseline or normal. And those enacting of physiological processes often are epigenetic in nature, right? And then initially the brain is kind of like pushing against this extreme reward state. And then after a while, it just kind of goes, I give up, because you're constantly agonizing or increasing this circuit, the reward circuit in the brain. So it eventually then says, okay, well, I'm going to develop a new baseline. So this is how we see tolerance emerging, right? So, I can drink 3 drinks and I'm okay. I get drunk. Oh, no, that's not enough now. I need 4, 5, 6, and so on. So the brain is constantly adapting to the changes that are being produced by substance use.
Cool. We've got some more comments coming in.
Okay.
We've got a lot of comments coming in, but and lots of hearts on the
okay.
Everybody's smashing the hearts like crazy tonight, so that's awesome to see. Excuse me. Adam Hoover, thanks for your comment. He says, I grew up in an abusive alcoholic household. Is there any way to explain why some people grow up and continue the cycle while others grow up to be very against substance use? I've always wondered.
Yeah, it's a great question, Adam, and I wish we had more concrete answers there, because certainly if we did know that, we would be able to intervene. But the reality is it's complex. How addiction unfolds is often due to a combination of both genetic and epigenetic impacts. And you can even they've done studies where it's like identical twins living in the same home, and one twin goes on and develops another alcohol use disorder, and the other twin doesn't, in spite of having identical genetics and identical home environment. So there's all these other factors. Of course, everybody has individual life histories as well, right? You could have peer influence there. You could have girlfriend or boyfriend influence. So there's lots of other environmental events that could be shaping how somebody, whether or not they develop that use disorder or an addiction. But there are vulnerability and resilience factors as well. So even if you take identical twins and one is raised in a completely different environment, we can see how that environment also differentially shapes the brain, regardless of life history. So lots of complexities there, and lots of more research to be done for sure.
Hmm. Got another one
On that
here.
point, I remember seeing a documentary on twins that were deliberately separated at birth, and they followed. And the study was basically like, what was it? Nature over nurture, nature over
Yeah.
whatever. I got, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, whatever.
I do. Yeah.
I tried to sound smart and I failed horribly. So,
No,
anyways.
no, you didn't. Now, I think it is. I think you're right. It's like nurture over nature or something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was
Mhm.
fascinating how their lives unfolded. We'll put it that way. So Amy Huard, she says, as an early childhood educator, I find the topic of epigenetics so fascinating. I've had my own addictions as well. Thank you for tying the information together so well.
You're welcome, Amy.
And Barry Kelly
Barry.
has a
Barry's
great
one of my
question.
former students.
Okay, I
Hey,
was
what's up,
like,
Barry?
this is pretty.
He's getting the exam for sure.
It's a pretty intense question here.
Okay,
So
this is why.
he's testing you.
Oh gosh.
If a manifestation of trauma is negative thought patterns, why are these thoughts difficult to extinguish and or recalibrate?
It's a great question, Barry, and I will ask you to recall your notes from. No, I'm just kidding. So we do know a lot of intrusive thoughts. Let's put it that way, right? When we sort of that negative state of mind, right? Depression is characterized by these negative thoughts, anxiety as well. A lot of the regulation of that is prefrontal cortical. So the very front part of our brain, the most anterior, so right in behind our forehead here, this part of the brain is really responsible for a lot of inhibitory connections. And there's a lot of research that shows that folks with early life trauma histories, highly stressful events, the ability of the prefrontal cortex to inhibit like other cognitive processes is impacted. So we do think that there's some elements of this disinhibition, this failure to sort of dampen down those negative thoughts that is due to the rewiring of certain parts of the prefrontal cortex. And this is why, and I don't know if I'm getting ahead of myself, some of the treatments that are very effective are those that work on mindfulness meditation and being and sort of regaining the strength or power of the prefrontal cortex in inhibiting those other lower brain regions, which are those that are kind of screaming out like, take the drug or eat the piece of chocolate cake, or you're a terrible human, right? Those horrible voices in our head that sometimes take control, right?
Got one more question coming in here, and then we're going to take a quick break and jump back into it.
Okay, so the next one comes in from Twinkle Van Fleet, and the question is there a likelihood percentage for substance use disorder or alcoholism? It seems circumstances would be the nudge toward it, pain, physical or mental. Is there really any way to prevent it? Better coping strategies or...
Yeah, and I think, Daniel, we were going to have a conversation about genetics, and there is no one gene for any drug addiction. There's no gene for alcoholism. There's no gene for opioid use disorder. It's not a foregone conclusion to have even a first-degree relative, so a parent, for example, that has an addiction, and for the child to therefore develop that addiction. Absolutely, you're at risk. There's a higher propensity, but there is no one gene that controls for that. And so what I would say is that environmental input is super important in shaping the brain and therefore the behavior and therefore the likelihood of developing these substance use disorders. So that's why, again, it's all the more important for care practitioners, the healthcare system, to be aware of these experiences, to be able to intervene appropriately. But unfortunately, as we know, the healthcare system is often stigmatizing and stigmatized, and the ability for us to adequately manage addictions is hampered by the fact that not a lot of funding, not a lot of conversation, not a lot of openness to recognizing that somebody who's using a substance might actually need some help and support. So that's why we're
Mm.
here to change those conversations, right?
Okay, we're going to take a quick break here, and I just want to let my viewers and listeners know that tonight's episode is also brought to you in part by Naranon Groups in Regina, Saskatoon, Swift Current, and Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. To learn more about all our sponsors, check out our upcoming live streams or our recorded audio releases and more, visit www.hardknockstalks.com. While you're there, pick up a t-shirt because we can't give everyone away for free. So, let's talk about the role of protective factors when it comes to reducing the impact of early life trauma
Mm-hmm.
on addiction. So, traumatic experiences have already happened.
Mm-hmm.
How can we
Mm-hmm.
mitigate the likelihood of it moving into a substance use challenge?
Mm-hmm. So for sure, if we're in an environment where this is possible, and I want to emphasize that, related to what I was just saying earlier, that often substance use is cloaked in shame. There's not a lot of openness, right? So
Mm-hmm.
particularly when we're parenting, there's a lot of stigma as well with mothering and parenting a child who is a mother who's using substances. So being mindful of the possibility for open conversation, I would say the best way to intervene if we know somebody has experienced early life trauma is to engage in the best supporting lifestyle factors. So the brain is an organ. It's the organ of your mind, and much like every organ in your body, it benefits greatly from what I would call like the four pillars of mental health. Five if you want to include spirituality, but sleep, diet, exercise, social connections are those four pillars of mental health. So somebody who's experienced early life trauma in particular would benefit from ensuring that they have adequate social support. Huge piece here, and being predictive of mitigating some of the impacts of trauma on the brain. Sleep, needing those 8 hours of sleep, very hard for us all to get, but everybody benefits from that, not just people who've experienced trauma. Adequate diet. We know there's a delicate interaction of the kinds of nutrients that we consume and how that impacts metabolic centers in the brain. Like I said, we know trauma impacts those metabolic systems. So having a healthy diet, not full of saturated fats, not processed food, is really critical. And then exercise. So there's like this really nice emerging niche of I have a colleague, Dr. Francine Daroche. You should interview her at some point. She's amazing. She does trauma and violence informed physical activity research. So she works with populations. She has worked with populations of women in the downtown east side of Vancouver who have history of trauma, who've had a history of intimate partner violence. And the benefit of having regular exercise that's trauma informed among this community, she demonstrates that it's incredibly powerful. And the brain likes glucose and oxygen, right? How does that happen? When we increase aerobic activity to the brain. So those protective factors, I would say, are the key lifestyle factors. So if somebody has had those histories of early life trauma, being mindful of those factors would be really important.
That's interesting because, like, even I've been in recovery for some time now. I've been healing for a while, and still to this day, when my anxiety goes up, when it gets almost to a point where it becomes unmanageable, my brain wants to go to the couch. Like, I want to go and lay on the couch and turn
I
on
know.
Netflix and try to have a nap.
Yep.
And
Eat potato
but
chips.
exactly, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But I know
Mm-hmm.
well enough that if
Mm-hmm.
I go to the gym, I will feel better. And I did that just today. So it's good
Good
that
for you.
that came up. And yeah, it's been
And it's that part of not only going to the gym, but also the awareness, that self-awareness of that actually really worked and made me feel better.
Mhm,
That final step is so crucial
mhm,
for recovery, I would say.
mhm. Why doesn't
Yeah.
it why doesn't it just like turn into my automatic thing like bing, time to go to the gym? Like why does it got to be a fight?
I would say give it time, Daniel.
Hmm.
I would say it may not be a fight forever. right?
Mm-hmm.
Some people just need to have that, need to push themselves
Mm-hmm.
for a lot longer. For other people, it's everybody's journey is unique. So I would say there may be a day where you actually are craving the gym.
Mm-hmm. And I do have some days like that.
Yeah.
And yeah. So, anyways, now I know we talked a little bit about it already, but I want to dig into it a little more if we can about what are some of the most effective treatment strategies or options for people who have
Hmm.
experienced early life trauma and are now struggling with addiction.
Hmm. Yeah. So once again, a huge avenue of research, figuring out finally that there is no one size fits all solution, right? We have to have a lot of things in our toolbox, and what works for one person won't necessarily work for somebody else. And so I see a big future with individualized medicine, for example. I'm not sure if you've heard of some of the work that's really exciting, looking at basically taking like a biomarker uh, assay, right? Taking somebody's
Mm-hmm.
blood, recording brain waves, doing a brain scan, and being able to predict based on a whole combination of these things, hey, this is your best treatment plan because we've shown that your genes plus this biosignal and so on and so forth, this is what the best outcome for you.
Mm-hmm.
But as it is right now, we know that, especially with the history of trauma, we have to tackle the PTSD. And that there's now emerging research showing that, or suggesting that substance use disorders are a specific form of PTSD that may actually merit a separate form of treatment, but definitely tackling the PTSD, which the best way to treat that, we know the gold standard, cognitive behavioral therapy. But increasingly, there's now, I don't know if you've heard of EMDR,
I haven't.
eye movement desensitization
I have heard
response,
of that, but I would like you to
right?
tell us about it.
It's
Yes.
pretty, yes. So this research came out of people working with folks who've had trauma, so PTSD, and it's essentially what happens is somebody is recalling the trauma. So you have to be doing this in, of course, a safe space with somebody that is trusted. But as they're recalling the trauma, you do alternate tapping. Like you can tap your shoulders, you can tap your knees, or you can move your eyes back and forth. And as the theory is that as you're doing this recall of the traumatic event and you're doing this alternate tapping or eye movement, it's confusing the brain. And trust me, as a neuroscientist, when I first heard this, I was like, this sounds like neuroflapdoodle. But the
what is
research is
what is
pretty
flapdoodle?
compelling.
Let's hear the scientific.
Neuroflapdoodle is
Yeah,
just
yeah,
like, yeah, oh, the brain, people trying to say that use big words and confuse.
yeah.
But the research is pretty compelling in showing that it does seem to have an impact, and folks come out with some pretty good recovery odds following EMDR. The other exciting avenue of research is psychedelics. So I'm not sure how much you or our listeners or viewers here know about the research in particular with
1 second.
psilocybin.
Here we go. Hang on. Whoa,
Yes.
whoa, whoa.
Oh,
Onyx has a
Oh.
question.
Our good friend Onyx
okay.
Knight wanted to know, what are your thoughts on psychedelic therapy, in particular,
Ah,
excuse me,
mm,
psilocybin? And
Oh
yeah,
my gosh.
also there is Mombi over on YouTube asking, do you think that the use of psilocybin can help rewire the brain to not act on addictive habits of our past?
The
So,
stars align.
and I would say the answer is an encouraging yes. I think the research is really exciting in that space. I have a colleague at University of Calgary, Leah Hotchkiss. You should have her on your shows at some point as well, because this is her area of research, is looking at these novel psychopharmacotherapeutics for things like PTSD and cannabis use disorder. And yeah, the research is pretty fascinating in that space. Definitely something to watch. And it's pretty exciting to be doing this research right now because, as we're all aware, to be using illegal substances, and you can imagine in the States, it's far worse than it is here, to use illegal substances as a method of therapy. I mean, they tried to do it in the 60s with LSD, all
Down
kinds of
in
controversies there as to what happened. But
down in Weyburn.
now, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And even at McGill, they used to do that. Um, there's good evidence to show that it can be extremely beneficial. There's also ayahuasca. I'm not sure if you've heard of that. It's like a traditional herb mixture that's from parts of Central America that are used often in conjunction with a shaman. So the key is having somebody there, like there's like a therapist or somebody, a practitioner, to be able to guide and support what's happening with their, you're taking it in their presence. And the way that I think it works in the brain, and I hypothesized this a few years ago, and I think the research is actually showing that this is the case, is what we think happens with psychedelics that aren't addictive, by the way. I'll argue that psychedelics are not addictive. Doesn't mean that we should go out and take them all the time, for sure. Everything. Yeah, let's not go there.
Yeah.
But
challenge accepted.
No. What I think happens is that these psychedelics are rapidly initiating growth factors in the brain. And essentially, it's like our brain is, it's formed of all these neurons that make synapses or connections with one another. And imagine you've got these connections in the brain, and I'm very oversimplifying, but that are like related to your trauma. It's like a hard, well-worn road in your brain that's just like trauma, stress, use, trauma, stress, use, stress, trauma, use. And it's when we take psychedelics, it creates these growth factors that allow the brain to sort of be remodeled like clay, and that you have these new circuits or new paths in the brain that, again, in the process of undergoing therapy at the same time, you're learning to process that trauma differently. And that sort of like stress, trauma, use roadway is now you've got another way, right? Stress and trauma doesn't necessarily lead to substance use. So it's like adding fertilizer to the brain to rapidly change connections in the nervous system. That's my theory.
We've got a
exciting stuff.
comment from Solan. Sorry, I caught Dawn off guard there.
Caught me slipping there. I was processing what Kim was saying. It's just fascinating stuff. So before we get to Solan's comment, I'm also wondering about Kambo. Like, we have a couple of friends who are Kambo practitioners. Could the same argument be made for that
I don't know
potentially?
what Kambo is. What is Kambo?
Kambo.
We stumped the neuroscientist.
Stumped me. How do you spell
Hard
that?
Knocks talks.
Phonetically, Kambo.
Are you really going to Google it while we're live on the stream?
No.
And it's
No.
it's the secretions from a toad from the rainforest. It's been heavily used like for centuries in like Peru
is
and
it
stuff like that.
Bufatine?
We don't know.
We don't know. I was just wondering.
Okay.
Anyways,
is this like the toad licking? Okay, so it's very much similar. Okay.
Yeah.
Kambo. Check it out.
So anyways.
And then let us know what you think.
I will.
Yeah.
So anyways, Solan says, as a shaman, I cannot express the significance of being in a safe place for these kinds of treatment. And I'm certain our friend Onyx would 100% agree. She's
Thank
also
you, Solan.
a practitioner.
For sure. Yep. Oh, I've purges the mind. Okay. Looking up all these things. See, I learned.
You are Googling while you're on the live stream. You totally are.
I am.
Yeah.
I'm an incredible multitasker.
So it would seem. So when we look forward, what are some of the promising outlooks in the field of genetics or epigenetics and addiction?
Yeah, so I think, and I don't think I ever fully answered. You had one of the viewers who said that they were concerned about their grandchildren, right? So I just want to emphasize that what is interesting about epigenetics, and this has been studied often in indigenous populations, and I want to emphasize that the work that I'm aware of has been done by Indigenous scholars. So this is really important that there's data sovereignty among Indigenous peoples to be because they have been so exploited throughout society and taken advantage of by scientists. But now we have these brilliant Indigenous scholars that are starting to do work in this space. In particular, my colleague Dr. Amy Bombay, who's out at Dalhousie, has been studying how the experience of residential schools, how we can see the epigenetic inheritance of the impact of residential schools. So it does appear to be that children whose parents were in residential school are impacted, but also the grandchildren. And this, it begs the question: how is this inherited? Right? How are epigenetic changes inherited? Because the epigenetics is the environment shaping the genes. And now there's some really cool research coming out looking at it, not necessarily with addiction, but in the field of childhood abuse. And there's scientists at McGill University who's been able to use brains that have been donated to the brain bank, and they can explore epigenetic changes in these brains, and also look at sperm and egg and cells. And what they found is, lo and behold, the sperm carries the signal of the epigenetic changes. So in fact, they can be inherited through the germ cell line, which is pretty wild, right? And it goes against, like, when we thought about like Darwin, right, who was the father of genetics, and how genes were carried through and inherited through the process of, remember those Punnett squares, right? And Lamarck, who was against him, and he was like, well, giraffes have long necks because they stretch out their necks to eat the acacia leaves, and that's how then their babies have these stretched necks. And that wasn't true, but now we know actually it could be that these changes in our body that happen as a result of the environment can be inherited epigenetically. And again, I want to say the sort of exciting elements of the research here is being able to intervene, right? Knowing this, knowing, knowledge is power. Knowing what we know about how epigenetic changes can be inherited, can we possibly, as I was saying earlier, ensure that our children, our grandchildren, and so on and so forth, future generations, are aware of family history to be able to, guide decision making about substances, right? That's what I always say. I'm always, harm reduction 101, right? Here's the information. Here's what you should know, that if you have X, Y, Z in your family history, you're at a higher risk, and you have these genes, and you're at higher risk of developing a substance use disorder. Maybe you should be aware of your substance use, right? And, yeah. So knowledge is power.
Do you think the hugs, not drugs way of thinking is sometimes effective?
I've not heard that expression. I've heard pugs, not drugs.
I can see how that would be effective. Pugs are amazing.
Pugs are amazing. But do you mean like giving your kids, like, where does this come from?
Like
who's giving the hugs?
Like love, not drugs. Like nurture.
It was a whole elementary school awareness thing. Like, it was on par with the just say no, because hugs are better than drugs. Oh yeah. Do you remember I asked you about the brain and the pan and the egg in the pan? Yeah. It was around that same time frame that this was quite popular.
Hugs,
I remember seeing it even on billboards. Hugs are better than drugs.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of theories too that addiction is a disorder of social attachment, right? That there, there's the changes in the brain are all in areas that are involved in social connection and social attachment. And so the theory is that because of ill-formed attachments, often it is that addiction is formed after neglect or parental abuse and so on, that an individual grows up not being able to form normal human attachments, relationships, and instead turns to substances to form those attachments. So yeah, maybe that goes alongside with the hugs not drugs kind of approach.
Hmm.
But yeah.
That certainly makes sense. I just wish that, at
Mhm.
that time, there was a little bit more elaboration, as you just put it, to kind of connect those
Yeah,
dots.
Mhm.
It's
I
a little
know.
bit
It
of
was
a vague
like
statement.
that whole 1980s Nancy Reagan "Just Say No" was just riddled with like how to shame people, how to, scare tactics, which we now know don't work.
Hmm. Got a couple more comments here, and let's just see. Um, Sorry, I'm confusing myself here. Mikey B, my friend, good to see you again tonight. Donna, Mikey's got a comment.
I'm on it. Mikey B says, I think people should really be careful dabbling in hallucinogens. I only use them to
Mm,
disassociate with reality and escape my negative emotions. While they had some mind blowing after effects and were fun, my attitude towards them was the same with alcohol and weed. Get me out of here because sobriety is miserable. Just my own
mhm.
experience.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Mikey. And just because I would say hallucinogens aren't addictive doesn't mean they're without harms, for
Mm-hmm.
sure.
Mm-hmm. And we've got David Young. Thank you for the comment, David.
Do we have that in the queue?
Yes, it's the
Okay.
second from the bottom.
Oh, here it is. Sorry. David Young says, it's great to know that with time, things are being brought to light. Back then, addiction and alcoholism were bad words, and this has to change. Even it still is that way today. Kind of filled in some blanks there, but
Hmm.
yep.
Hmm.
And our good friend
100% agree.
Sharon, she says, I'm going to be 70 this year. Ain't no way I'm going to be kept prisoner by my trauma. Oh, hell no. I've embraced it, dealt with it, and that's gospel right there. It's not easy, but I'm too old to let any shit win.
Go,
Ha!
Sharon.
Love it. Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, you
Yeah,
go down. You go down.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
before we let you go, there is another question that came up in the comments, and I believe it was Sharon. She said something to the effect of some things are too traumatic, some things are better left in the dark. Uh,
Mm.
is there any truth to that in your opinion?
Well, I mean, I'm not a therapist, but I have talked a lot with therapists and people that treat individuals with traumatic events in their past. And as I can quote one of my dear friends, Matthew, who says, the only way to get through the trauma is through the trauma. And
Mm,
so, if we want to come out the other end, we have to process it and make sense of it to be able to be truly healed from it. That's what I've heard some therapists say.
mhm,
Um, it. I think denial has been shown to not really be a great, um, you know, way of coping with trauma
mhm,
because I don't know if you've read The Body Keeps the Score or any of Gabor Mate's work on trauma. But even though you might not consciously be processing the trauma, it's having an impact on your body. So
mm,
that's a really important point, right? That it's still
mhm,
there. It's still impacting your organs and your cells. Um, and it's really important that somebody goes and moves through it,
mm.
which is hard, admittedly, very hard.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it sort of looks like the comments are slowing down a little bit. I know that we've
Ooh,
worked through all of the questions that we had for you
one,
this evening.
yeah.
Is there? Oh, wait a minute now.
I actually want to bring up our good friend Joe's comment here.
Well, and we do have one from Autumn here too. We've got a question.
Oh, did I miss one from Autumn? I'm sorry. So Joe Pelletier says, poisonous secretions of a giant monkey frog. Yep. I'm in.
Oh,
Sounds like a treatment for me. All kidding aside, loved, loved, loved the info tonight.
thanks,
Oh,
Joe.
Joe. Joe's been following from since very early on. In fact, he's been a guest on the show. We love you, Joe. We're always happy to see you.
Ah,
Yeah.
sweet.
And
Thank
here's one
you,
from Autumn.
Autumn.
I did miss that one. Is it true or is it not true, excuse me, that part of the brain shuts down during a traumatic event, which forces us to not remember, essentially the brain protecting itself?
You're absolutely right, Autumn. Yeah, there are lots of brain protective mechanisms in the brain with trauma, and it specifically impacts parts of the brain that are involved in processing, learning, and memory. So that this is why some people have complete and utter blackouts with highly traumatic events. This is why it's very hard to have a sexual assault victim on trial in court, because they can give, they're an unreliable witness, right? They give testimony that changes, and some lawyers will use that against them, but that is completely normal to have that happen if somebody's experienced a highly traumatic event. So yes, spot on. Neuroscience 101. Good for you. You get the A. There we go.
All right, my friend. Unless there's anything else that you would like to touch on?
You know what? We're good for now. Always happy to come back, Daniel, and keep talking brain science. And really appreciated the comments and questions from your longtime viewers. It sounds like you got a great community here, and I'm really glad to be a part of that with you.
Yes, so, definitely. Yeah. Thanks to the community
awesome
for engaging so actively tonight. That was amazing. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Thanks for engaging, and thank you so much, Kim, for joining us once again.
You're welcome.
We will see you again, but for now, take care, my friend.
For sure. Yeah. Take care. Good night.
All right, if you're getting something out of what we're doing here, you can find all our audios on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts, or live and interactive right here on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch TV. Thanks for watching. Take care, my friends.
Say, this is Hard Knox Talks.
Don't leave. Here comes the wheel. Look at that wheel. Thank you all so much tonight for engaging, for getting your name on the Wheel of Lessons. Oh, Wheel of Lessons, teach us a lesson.
and caring about my face. I just want to reiterate that.
Spin it. Who's it gonna be? Oh, Onyx, it was almost you. Rise North. Rise North on YouTube. I hope you're watching. We will try to get a hold of you. And if you want to reach out to us on the Facebook page inbox, please do so. If not, we will try to hunt you down. All right, everybody, that's all we've got for tonight. We will see you again next Sunday night. We have Andrew Hager coming on, the recovery influencer from down in Kentucky. Giant following here on Facebook. Gonna be a great show. Until then, take care, my friends.